So I'm going to give a talk for about an hour, and then we can discuss Q&A afterwards. Okay, that's our plan. My talk is entitled "Where is the Wisdom and Meaning in Life?" And I want to talk about a lot of the work that's being done, both within psychology and cognitive science, but also now increasingly within philosophy. Wolf's book, "Meaning in Life and Why It Matters," has set off quite a bit of philosophical work around this topic. In 2019, based on a lot of work that I've already been doing at the University of Toronto, I released a YouTube series called "Awakening from the Meaning Crisis." And I think the first episode is like something like 650,000 views. And so struck a nerve in some fashion. And then we've turned that into, with the help of a dear friend of mine, Christopher Mastier-Pietro, and a former student of mine, Madeline Abrahamian, we've turned this into a book, "Awakening from the Meaning Crisis," which was released on October 2024. And the book is actually making money, which is a sign of success for an academic. Okay. So the series in the book explored the historical genealogy of the meaning crisis. How did we get into it? I'll say a little bit more what it is. But what the series did was, in the book, explored how did we get into this, and it also did a lot of work on the cognitive science of this meaning. What is it that's going on when we're talking about meaning in life? And what I want to do is I want to explore that even more, that second point, the cognitive science of meaning, with you. Of course, cognitive science has one of its significant components is philosophy, so you'll see philosophical threads running through this. What I want to do is share with you some current work I'm doing towards a paper for publication with a student of mine, Arjun Arora. And as I do this, I'm also engaging in some self-criticism. I tell my students a mark of a rational person is that their willingness to self-criticize, to criticize their own theories, and I try to regularly practice that. Specifically, what I want to ask is, how does our current common and even professional psychological conception of meaning actually contribute to making the meaning crisis worse? So how we are conceiving of it professionally and even popularly is, I'm going to argue, part of the problem. Part of the problem. And that was not something I originally saw when I was talking about meaning in life. So I'm going to use a term from academic psychology. It's a term to talk about our explicit or implicit theoretical conceptualizations, sort of proto-theories that we might carry around largely, semi-consciously, but also get put into explicit philosophy. So the word that's used in psychology for that is a construct, the theoretical construct, okay? So don't confuse construct with concept. Construct is sort of the theories that people have either implicitly or explicitly about what meaning in life is. And what I want to do is I want to criticize the standard professional academic psychological construct of meaning in life, because I believe, as do its originators, that it approximates the general, what we call in psychology, the folk psychology that's held largely, like, implicitly by most people in our culture. So what they're trying to do with the psychological construct, the explicit academic one, is capture what is implicit in the populace. I think they're largely succeeding in that, thereby allowing me to criticize the general popular construct by criticizing the explicit published construct. So they saved me a lot of time. Okay, so first of all, the construct consists of a framing distinction between meaning of life and meaning in life. And what the psychologist, myself included, and here's a bit of self-criticism, I used to do this, they'll immediately rush in with this distinction and say, I'm not talking about the meaning of life. That's a grand metaphysical proposal, has something to do with the nature of reality in the cosmos. I'm not talking about any of that, you understand? Because, of course, psychology doesn't want to look like it's overlapping with either philosophy or religion. Instead, they'll talk about meaning in life. Meaning in life. I originally did the same thing. I originally endorsed this distinction because, I thought, as we were trying to engage on our empirical endeavors, trying to settle on a metaphysical consensus about the meaning of life would mean we would never get any research done. But I now am very critical about accepting that distinction, not because I think psychologists should presume to pronounce on the meaning of life, but as you'll see, what happened when they made that distinction is they made the discussion about ontology and the nature of the world irrelevant to meaning in life. And I think that's a very problematic move to make. Okay, so now that we have the framing distinction, what does the construct consist of? It consists of a list of 4 features. Okay, so it is literally a feature list, a list of features. The first is purpose. So I don't think I have to explain that too much to you, but if you have purpose in your life, generally you'll have more meaning in life. Meaning in life means that you consider life worth living even when things are horrible, even when you're not necessarily emotionally or affectively happy. The second is coherence. Your world has to be intelligible to you in some fashion. But that is, and I'll come back to this, that's only described from the subject side. It's not ever described from the world side, which is problematic. You'll see why in a couple of minutes. Significance. There has to be things in your life that are significant to you. I'm sorry, that sounds like just a simply tautology. That's part of my criticism, because when I ask psychologists that question, that's the answer they often give me, which is frustrating. But if you press on them, they mean something like, there's things in your life that are real, that aren't ephemeral, aren't superficial, aren't trivial. So there's deep things. That's often the word used, deep. So something like that. We'll come back to that. And then the next is mattering. Mattering is you feel that you are connected to something, and the metaphor for this, we'll come back to the metaphor, is you're connected to, you make a difference to something larger than yourself. And you can frequently get at this by asking people, what do you want to exist even if you don't? And how much of a difference do you make to it right now? Now, contrary to a lot of popular culture, purpose is not the most important factor for meaning in life. So our culture often uses purpose as a synonym for this, but even the existing empirical data says that's largely false. And it's really not purpose either. It's more something like having a compass, a moral and meaning compass by which you can find your direction through challenges. Mattering is the most important, and it looks like significance and mattering are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. They're not separate. They seem to belong together in some way. Now, when we've used this measure and various related measures, we get very inconsistent results about how meaningful, in the sense of meaning in life, people's lives are. There's a major survey done in 2019 in the UK, and you get like 80% of people in the younger adult range say their lives are meaningless. You older people are a little bit better, but 60%. Religion seems to move the needle a little bit, but not that much. Things like that. So that's pretty dark, right? And you have a lot of other related things that Chris and I'll refer to Christopher Mastropietro as Chris because he's a dear friend of mine. We call the symptomology of the meaning crisis. So, of course, many of you are aware, loneliness is massively increasing. I think you have a ministry of loneliness here now, or something like that. It's very Orwellian. And one of the things you should know, one of the things I can tell you, I'm both a cognitive scientist and a cognitive psychologist, is loneliness is as dangerous to your health as smoking. Like, it's really hard. It's really comprehensively hard. Of course, we have mental health issues, especially anxiety and depression are increasing. We have the increase around addictions. We have people suffering the 3 Bs. Sorry, what are the 3 Bs? Burnout. The burnout is going up massively. Hartmut Rosa talks about dynamic stability. We're having to work harder and harder, not just so we don't fall behind. And then when we burn out, we then flip to boredom, in which we don't like, and COVID showed this in spades, we don't like it when we can't be busy. It really gnaws at us. And then the third one, and I'm going to say a word, but I want you to know that this word is, I'm not attempting to be vulgar, this is now a professional, philosophical, academic term. It's been published, very famous essay by Harry Frankfurt on bullshit. That's the 3rd B, bullshit. And one of the things that Chris and I, with another co-author, Philip Misevic, did in an earlier book, is we noted the rise on just Google frequency of bullshit. And it has been since the 80s going up nonlinear, exponentially. People are coming to the conclusion, the opinion that there's more and more bullshit, and it's increasing and it's getting worse and worse. And so all of this doesn't, like, you're lonely, your mental health's challenged, you're possibly addicted, you're burnt out, bored, when you're being drowned in a tsunami of bullshit. Okay? And then there's what has now been called, Americans like grandiose terms, but this is their term, some academics, the trust apocalypse, which means reliable, bona fide, rigorous academic research. Trust in all institutions is in massive decline. Trust in the legal institution, the political institution, the educational institution, religious institutions. So you get the rise of spiritual but not religious, which means I want to do religious things, but I distrust the institution. Then you also have a displacement phenomenon in which it looks like what people are doing is they're trying to find missing meaning in life. This, I think, is part of the explanation for my colleague and friend's meteoric rise to godhood, namely Jordan Peterson, in which he galvanized the public, and pro or con, I'm not asking you to take a stand on Jordan Peterson. That's not my point. My point is he galvanized people dramatically. Ian McGilchrist, same thing. So these people who are out there talking about meaning in life are drawing huge audiences. And I don't just mean lay audiences, there's lots of that. Since I did my series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I actually have had more academic connections than I ever had just going through the university system. Because I get all kinds of academics reaching out to me, interested in that. Okay? And then, of course, you have the fact that we have, pseudo-religious mythologies that dominate popular culture, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, all of that. And then people get, they get, righteous indignation when these mythologies are transgressed against. And if you don't think these have a religious fervor to them, because I've done this, go to Comic-Con as an anthropologist, and you'll see people spending an entire day dressing up as their role models, exchanging sacred objects, going through rituals, and living in this world that has a lot of what is missing in their everyday world. This is why video games are so important. What's in this world? There's a clear narrative that orients people in it. There's a clear structure of rules that make sense of this world. And there is a way to level up, to self-transcend. There's a hunger for this. It's called the virtual exodus. People are now more and more saying they prefer that virtual world than the real world, or reality is broken is another slogan. Because the virtual worlds, either digital virtual or imaginational virtual, are preferred to the real world because they have these dimensions that are missing in the world. And notice what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the world. Are missing in the world of these people. Of course, you get nihilistic movies and they spring up. Everything, everywhere, all at once. It's all about nihilism. And then there's a little bit of ending that doesn't make any sense. Well, a mother should be loyal to her daughter. Well, why is that not called into question? You call everything else into question. So nihilism, Joker's another movie, not the recent one with the singing. The older one. And of course, we wrote a book on this, Chris and Philip and I, the pervasiveness of a very new myth that has only existed since basically the 20th century and has only come into prominence since the 1980s, which is the zombie. Why are zombies so big? And why do they continue to remain big? And they're very different than the other monsters. They're not supernatural. They are us decayed. Zombies have lost the capacity for meaning making. They're often hungry to consume the organ that makes meaning, the brain. They consume, but they're never satisfied. They move en masse, but they have no community, and they drift aimlessly. And they represent a perversion of resurrection. They are coming back from the dead, but to something worse than life. Zombies are the myth for expressing the meaning crisis. You also have, in addition to sort of just loss, things like loneliness and mental health and displacement, what I've just talked about, you have replacement. You have many people going through things in which they're trying to cultivate wisdom and meaning in life together. I'm going to explain how those are interconnected in a minute. There are more Stoics now alive than were ever alive in the Roman Empire. How? Just like stand back, almost like if you were from Mars or something. Like, what is going on? Right? We have, as I've already mentioned, the ever-growing demographic of spiritual but not religious. In fact, if you're at a party and you don't say that you're spiritual but not religious, people often will look at you strangely because it's expected. It's a growing demographic expectation. There's something wrong with you if you're not you in particular. Something wrong with you if you're spiritual. If you're not spiritual but not religious. Of course, we've had the growth of yoga and Zen and meditation, and we're going with what's called the mindfulness revolution. I'm a longtime practitioner and teacher on various styles of Buddhist meditation. I have criticisms of the mindfulness revolution, but I acknowledge that it represents something. Right? We have the psychedelic renaissance. Psychedelics are big and are being studied and explored. I expect they'll be legalized in Canada after the conservatives are going to come into power. There'll be about 10 years they'll be in power. Psychedelics will be legalized during that time, and then when the liberals get back in, because that's what Canada does, then by then I predict psychedelics will be legalized. Whether that's good or bad is something else we can talk about. And something that's very pervasive and really interesting to me. I got interested in philosophy because I went in my very first year, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, very first undergraduate year. One of the first books I encountered was Plato's Republic, the figure of Socrates, and the topic of love of wisdom, and I just fell in love with it. Under the illusion that that's what academic philosophy would be. And the topic of wisdom, when I was an undergrad, just falls off the table. You do epistemology, metaphysics, you do ethics, you do all of that. I went on to get my PhD in philosophy because I valued all of those skills. I'm not here to diss philosophy. That would be the last thing I do. But the philosophy as the philia, the love, the fellowship love of wisdom falls off the table. That's no longer the case. I teach a course on the psychology and the cognitive science of wisdom at the University of Toronto. So since about the 1990s, psychologists and cognitive scientists have been talking very seriously about philosophy, about wisdom, and the philosophy of wisdom has now come back into the universities. And there's a reason for that, because there is a felt sense of loss. When I start talking about that topic and related topics, my students, their eyes widen. They want to know more about that. They want to know more about that. Okay. Yet, given all of that, very mixed bag, right? There's lots of loss, loneliness, there's lots of displacement that's unhealthy. There's some healthy replacement. But for all of that, right, and in contrast to that UK survey, which was very extensive, that most people find their lives meaningless, some of the scientific studies that have been done using the explicit psychological construct have found that most people are above median in meaning in life. So generally, most people's lives are pretty meaningful to them. It's like, how is this hanging together? Now, there's a problem with this. A lot of that research has some problems attached to it. I'm not saying there's any fraud or anything like ridiculous. But for example, the coherence part of the feature list by Heinzelman, that has failed twice to replicate something. So do you see what I'm saying? What we actually have from the empirical data, you get the UK survey, 80% of people say their lives are meaningless. So a couple of much smaller numbers. No, most people's lives are meaningful, but the construct has failed to replicate. This is a mess. This is actually a mess. So here's more self-criticism, ways in which John Vervaeke was not on the ball. So I made something of a career academically out of criticizing psychological construct. I've published on why we have serious criticisms of the mindfulness construct, rationality, wisdom. And I'm the guy talking a lot about meaning. So what should John have done? John should have stepped back and reflected critically on the meaning and life construct. And I didn't. I just adopted it and started using it. I want to now address that. I think the reason why we're getting these inconsistent results, and I'm going to strengthen this argument, is because the construct is extremely problematic, not only theoretically, but also existentially. All right. First criticism. Is it okay if I use it? So we have a feature list. Okay. So what is, and remember I told you the 4 features. It's a list of features. Now, we know something about this. Classic work done way back in 1985, massively replicated, no doubt about it, no reasonable doubt about it. This is what people think their understanding of something is. They think their understanding is just a feature list they have in their brain. So that's what people think that their understanding is. But that same research shows that's not what their understanding is. Let me try and make it sort of intuitively obvious. You ask people, what's a bird? Well, it has wings, it has feathers, it has a beak, and it flies. So I'll pile some feathers here, put a couple of wings, put a beak, gather it all up, and toss it into the air. Do I have a bird? No, I have a David Cronenberg movie or something. Okay, and so, I mean, you're philosophy students, you know better than I do what's missing. What's missing is the structural functional organization, the formal cause that actually carries a lot of what it is to be a bird. How is it structurally organized so it reliably functions as a causal agent in the world? That's missing. And if you'll allow me a little bit of trespass on language, that's where most of the birdiness of the bird is, right? And people have a very hard time even recognizing that, making it explicit and articulating it. You can show that they have that judgment. I want you to answer a question really quickly, okay? Don't think about it, because this is a psych experiment. I'm not asking for your expertise as philosophers, okay? Okay, ready? You're going to yell out the answer. Which kind of bird sings? A small one or a large one? Go.
Fall.
How'd you do that? It's not in the feature list. Because you have a structural functional model and you know, right, different things, and they're small, they tend to nest in trees, so they have to sing. It's all there. It's all there, and it's like that. And we got a clue, by the way. Remember I mentioned earlier that there's a missing structural functional organization in the feature list for meaning in life, because they're already getting evidence that somehow significance and mattering belong together, fit together in some way. But how is like, don't know. Oh no. So that's my first criticism. It's a feature list, and it should have a formal cause, or to use psychological language, if you'll allow me, it shouldn't be a feature list, it should be a feature schema. Okay? Because the schema carries most of the understanding. Here's another criticism, and this is similar to a criticism I made a long time ago with Leo Ferraro publication, 2012, about wisdom. Well, my supervisor, when I was getting my PhD in philosophy, it was Jack Stevenson, and his supervisor was Roger Chisholm. And he made a really important argument that I think deserves to be a little bit more famous. So he distinguished between two types of theories in epistemology: a process theory and a product theory. Product theory is what you're trying to do is provide the best candidate for what wisdom is. You're trying to provide the best description of what it is. A process theory is where you give an account of how people become more wise, how they develop wisdom. And you do the same thing with knowledge. What is knowledge? How do people get it? Does that make sense? And what he pointed out is we treat these as if they're independent, but they're not, interdependent. In order to pick out the things that I'm going to call knowledge, I have to have an implicit theory about how knowledge is acquired. And in order to explain how knowledge is acquired, I have to have an implicit theory about what knowledge looks like. And so what he said we actually have to do is have mutual explication and explanation of the two constructs at the same time. The problem with the meaning in life is it's just a product. This is what it is. There's no, but how do we get it? How do we develop it? How do we learn it? Okay. So the developmental or teleological dimension of meaning in life is missing, which is very strange given that purpose is one of the features. I'm trying to get you to see how this is actually, there's a lot of implicit contradictions in the construct. Now, those two things are related because without an account of the structural functional organization, how it is structured to function, you can't actually say the process involved. Processes involve an understanding of structural functional organization. Okay, another problem with the construct. This one, I think, will hit more closely home to philosophers. See, meaning is what Williams calls a thick term. Okay? So here's a thin term, red. That is red. It's just descriptive. Okay? A thick term is a term that's not only descriptive, it's also prescriptive. It has a normative dimension in it. There's some measuring against standards of what's true, good, or beautiful. So here's an obvious thick term. Nobody really disputes that this is a thick term, rational. If I describe you as rational, I'm also praising you. I'm recommending that people take note of you, perhaps correct their behavior to be more like yours. And I can also do the opposite. I can say, stop being so irrational. Notice how that feels. Yeah, that's okay to say that. Stop being so red doesn't make it right. What? Meaning is the same thing. It's a thick term. I'm not just striving. If I say, and I believe it is true, Douglas has a meaningful life, I'm not just describing. I'm recommending that you consider his life. You consider examining it, perhaps correcting yours to make it more like what is in his life. It is a thick term. It has a normative dimension in it. When you say your life is meaningless, you're actually recommending to someone that they need to do something. You need to do something. You should do something. Like you'd be a little bit stymied if you said, I think your life is really meaningless. And the person goes, yeah. That's not what you're after. Whereas if you say to somebody, hey, you're tall. Yeah, I'm tall. So this normative dimension, notice how this is all making sense. There's no structural functional organization, no formal cause. We don't have any sort of final cause. We don't have the developmental trajectory, right? We don't have a process theory. And we're also noticing the normativity is missing. So if you put the fact that it's normative, it has a normative dimension, and it's developmental, then meaning in life is actually aspirational. This is a technical term introduced by Edmund Hillary. Aspirational. Aspiration is the process by which you are trying to become a better self. Mm-hmm. And there's things that predict that, by the way. The two things that predict people's work with Jinsun Kim, a student of mine, a colleague of mine, on what predicts people actually engaging in successful personal projects of aspiration. Two things: doing it with other people, that's kind of internalizing a role model. Those are the making plans, putting it in your phone, all that doesn't do anything. Internalizing a role model, doing it with other people, are predictive of successful aspiration. Remember that. Now, you put the aspirational and the normative and the developmental together. And there's an important implication of this that I've done some empirical work on. Mystical experiences, which have a degree of tremendous normativity, people think they're getting closer to the really real, right? It's obviously developmental. They think they're transcending in some fashion. It's aspirational. They're becoming better. So mystical experience should, if here's an empirical prediction. If you have some mystical experiences, will you find your life more meaningful? We predicted yes. I know, not a radical hypothesis. What's radical is nobody had ever thought to check. You've got hundreds of years, cross-cultural, cross-historical, people talking about mystical experience, leading to radical transformations in their sense of meaning. And nobody does the empirical question. Do mystical experiences have an impact on meaning in life? So we did the work, we did a massive survey online. Turns out they do. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is you sort of knew that was the case. The fact that it had to be done is telling. Okay? The standard meaning in life construct has no explanation for why mystical experience should improve meaning in life so dramatically, so powerful. It does. The aspirational involves two relations. You have a relationship to your future self, I'll call that the horizontal relation, and you have an aspiration to your higher self, I'll call that the vertical. So these dimensions are always intrinsic to any aspirational project. I want my future self to be my better self. I have some standard of an ideal that's better in some way than me. I can level up to, but I'm also going to work towards it and make my future self into that. These two dimensions of the horizontal and the vertical are completely missing from the meaning of life construct. What's really telling is we have very powerful empirical evidence that this horizontal axis and this vertical axis are central to so much of cognition. So much. They are central to so much of how we try to make sense of reality and make sense of ourselves in reality. And yet those dimensions are missing from the meaning in life construct. Okay, another related criticism. Sorry, I'm going to keep hammering on this. Part of it is I'm trying to atone for my guilt, not noticing this, but also I think this is an important point. I'm very concerned about the meaning crisis and the suffering it causes. It is widely acknowledged that meaning in life is extremely universal. We don't find cultures where meaning in life isn't an issue. Except maybe ours. Okay. And it's powerful. You don't have a meaning in life. Meaning in life is predictive of mental health, physiological health, social well-being, blah, blah. It's like really important. You don't have it, you're in trouble, seriously. Okay, so we know it's universal, we know it's powerful. Okay, so the conclusion that's drawn from an evolutionary perspective is, so it must be adaptive. I think this is a plausible conclusion. I don't have any argument against that. But then you ask the question, okay, how is it adaptive? Everything, that has an evolutionary explanation is adaptive. My foot is adaptive. My eyes are adaptive. Like just saying meaning in life is adaptive isn't an explanation. What's the explanation? But there's no theoretical machinery in an inert, structureless, featureless, that has no process and no development and none of these dimensions. There's no basis from which to build an explanation. There's no structural functional organization, there's no process account, there's no aspirational account. And that means we can't do something we need to do. There's another important construct called existential resilience. This is how people deal with like existential crises, grief of a beloved, sudden loss of a career. Existential resilience is how do people deal with it, bounce back from it without collapsing, falling into suicide, or at least depression and things like that. It has to do with meaning in life. But there's wide variation in how well people have existential resilience. So that what that predicts is we should find wide variation in people's meaning in life. So let me do the argument again. what makes a difference to how well you go through existential, right, resilience, existential crisis, is how good your meaning in life is. Yes, a lot of variation in how people handle existential crisis. That reverse predicts, which is called post-it, but it should show up in a lot of variation in meaning in life between people. But when we do the scientific measure, oh, everybody's sort of above median. We should all be handling this all really well. But we're not handling grief well, and we don't handle disruption even to daily routine. COVID showed this. There was a mental health tsunami after COVID. Many relationships ended, friendships, marriages, all kinds of things. It was disastrous. And a lot of conspirituality just caught on fire during that time. All right, so what do we have? Meaning in life is a very shallow construct. And when you ask, well, how do I get more? You're just given a really weak quantitative answer. Just get more of these. The qualitative, which is what I've been talking about, all this dynamic, structural, the formal cause, the final cause, right? The process, the normative dimensions, the aspirational dimensions, all of that is missing. So we can't be given any good qualitative answer to the question, what makes a life more meaningful? Okay, let's go back to putting together the functional and the normative. Let's go back to the central metaphors. The central metaphor that Wolf talks about in his book, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. There's a bit of a pun in there because mattering is one of the features. Academic joke. Okay. Okay, so she rightly points out, so the metaphor people use is, I want to be connected to something larger than myself. Obviously, they don't mean that literally. If you chain them to a mountain, they don't go, oh, such fulfillment, right? That's not what's going on. Okay, so it's a little bit unclear. So what I'm giving you is an argument. I'm not representing a consensus, but I'm not representing something that's not treated with respect either, okay? I argue, because of cross-historical and cross-cultural evidence, that what people are talking about is better understood this way. When you're in a dream, you're in a little world, right? And you think it's real. But you wake up, or you turn on a light, and this is why awakening and enlightenment metaphors are cross-culturally pervasive. You wake up to a wider world that you judge more real than the dream world, because the wider world can show you the biases and prejudices and limitations of the dream world. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Judgments of realness are comparative judgments. They're never straight judgments. We're always comparing something against something else in terms of its capacity to generate intelligibility. So this means that what people are talking about is they want to wake up to something more real. Remember, the significance is deep. What they mean by deep, I think, is more real. They want to be connected to something that's more real. So as you put that in, and the understanding that there's a normative and developmental and aspirational dimension, rationality comes in. Rationality is needed for meaning in life. If I'm trying to aspire to be better than I am necessarily committed to a process of self-correction and self-transcendence. If I'm measuring myself against the standard, and I'm trying to get closer to my standard, I'm engaging in self-correction. See, the primary, contrary again, I won't go into this, I could do a whole talk on this if you want. Rational doesn't mean logical. Okay? It doesn't mean logical. That is a completely moribund idea. Right? You can't be comprehensively logical. There's too much information to process within and within. Just overwhelming. I'll use a technical term. It's computationally intractable. Being rational, and this is way more nuanced, is knowing when, where, and what you need to be logical, which is a different thing. Because the key about rationality is not logicality. The key to rationality is how systemically are you overcoming self-deception. That's the measure. of rationality. And there's all kinds of dimensions on it. Some of them are logical, some of them are perspectival. A big way of overcoming a lot of versions of self-deception is overcoming egocentrism, which isn't a logical move, it's a perspective. Normativity, rationality has that one branch, overcoming self-deception, engaging in self-correction, a form of self-transcendent. It also means being reasonable, which isn't equivalent or synonymous to being rational. In legal philosophy, I imagine British is similar because Canada is an orphan child. In the United States and Britain had a child and left it in the snow. That's the reasonable person, there's this sort of set of characteristics. The reasonable person is not gifted in making an argument. They're gifted at sizing up a situation, realizing what is relevant in that situation, and assuming the appropriate role for that situation. So that's why you could be found criminally negligent. Well, I didn't do anything. Yeah, but you should have. You should have. You should have sized up the situation, very perspectival. You should have sized up the situation. You should have zeroed in on the relevant information, and if you should have realized the responsible role to take. Okay. See, a lot of rationality is about overcoming self-deception and being reasonable. It's not about primarily logical argumentation. Sorry, to step on maybe some of your toes, I don't mean to. People in academic philosophy who are very gifted at presenting moral arguments and arguments for moral conclusions about behavior, that is not predictive of them being moral in their life. Okay? It's not. Reliably. Okay? So put all that together, and I can't do a lecture on this, but when you're overcoming self-deception, you're engaging in self-transcendence, you're developing perspective, states of mind, skills, virtues for what role to take and be responsible. We're talking about wisdom now. We're talking about wisdom. We're talking about wisdom. And that shouldn't surprise you. Unlike this construct, if you look cross-culturally, cross-historically, the pursuit of eudaimonia, of meaning in life, happiness, has always been interwoven deeply with the cultivation of wisdom. Because wisdom is addressing all these missing lacuna that I have been pointing out. It's about all of them. It's about all of them. But if I was to ask a psychologist doing meaning in life, well, where's this connection to wisdom? They would look at me like, well, that's it. Meaning in life, as it's standardly understood, cannot explain the massive empirical evidence for the deep interweaving of wisdom and meaning in life. Hence the title of my talk. Where's the wisdom in meaning in life? This brings up another missing dimension. You're in philosophy, philia, fellowship, something done with others, the fellowship love of wisdom. Wittgenstein, Hegel, I just throw names because you're philosophers, so you know it, right? Right? And then most recently by Brandon. Okay, Wittgenstein, quickly. You're familiar with the no private language argument, right? Meaning has to be shared in order to, you can't have a private language. Lewis Carroll, I forget which it is, the character who said they can use words however they want. I can use the word tide and mean cooperation. You can't do that. We have to agree, we have to share meaning of a term or it becomes meaningless. That is a constitutive feature of meaning. It has to be shareable. Also, there's a normative dimension of meaning. How do we do correction? We rely on each other. For the undeniable hard fact, really massively replicated, that I am really bad at noticing my biases and I'm really good at noticing yours. Vice versa. There's a lot of work being done on this, that rationality, self-correction is inherently dialogical in nature. It requires philia. It requires shared meaning and shared correction. The way a language evolves, who's running English? Doesn't make any sense. It changes, and there's normativity around it. You can't use the word queen to refer to cancer among crabs at the bottom of the Atlantic. It doesn't work. Okay. One question we should be asking as psychologists when we're asking somebody, is your life meaningful? We should be asking, and how shareable is it with other people? How much do you share it? And we should be asking this because what is it when you have shared meaning? What does it conduce? Trust. If we agree that we're going to have shared meaning and shared mutual correction, that is one of the ways you engender trust between people. The trust apocalypse is raging over here. They're not asking about the self-correction and the shareability of meaning in life. And so meaning in life is over here, disconnected. So the historical cultural dimension of meaning in life is completely missing from the construct. But meaning is historical cultural in nature. And so we got this weird thing that should be an obvious contradiction. Loneliness is going up. The number of close friends people have on average is reliably declining decade by decade. The number of people who live absolutely alone is reliably increasing decade by decade. People are lonely and they're distrustful, but their lives are meaningful. It doesn't make sense. What you're getting is a complete withdrawal. Meaning in life is this completely, purely subjective, purely private matter inside my own little cocoon, and I'm hiding behind it and not looking at the world. Now, that kind of makes sense. It's an individually rational thing to do because the world, when you ask people how the world is, they'll tell you it's extremely chaotic. But you see, when you do that, have you heard of the phrase a tragedy of the commons? You know, tragedy of the commons is when people do what is individually subjectively rational, but it leads to a collective irrationality. Classic example, 1929, the stock market's going down. What should you do with your stocks? You should sell your stocks. But if everybody sells their stocks, what happens to the stock market? It collapses and the economy tanks. That's a tragedy of the commons. As we all start to cocoon into this little tiny personal bubble, and we know it actually doesn't work because COVID, but people pretend and they go this, we're leading to a tragedy of the commons because we're severing the connections that constitute meaning. See, meaning isn't like it isn't in you. It's not a subjective possession. I have a whole other scientific talk I can give about how I think meaning in life is related to something that I think is at the heart of general intelligence called relevance realization. And I'm trying not to talk about relevance realization in this talk because if you're around me, usually more than 35 seconds, I start talking about relevance realization. This is how all the information you could be paying attention to in this room, which is astronomically vast, by the way, all the information in your memory, all the possibilities you consider, all the sequences of actions you can generate, you ignore most of that. You find, and you foreground and find salient what matters, what is relevant. Hear the word, what matters to you. You see it? This is why meaning in life is so functional. It's at the core of your cognitive agency. You have to do this because if you try to pay attention to all the information that is actually available to you in this room, you would need and I mean this literally, technically, formally, you would need the rest of the history of the universe and you would still not get it all. By the way, that's why self-correction is also unavoidable because when I'm doing this and ignoring all of this, I am biasing my attention. And it means I might be ignoring what I should be paying attention to. That's how self-deception works. But let's talk about this. Where is relevance? Is it in the object? Was it relevant to you before I picked it up? No, but now it's salient and relevant. Well, now that it's relevant, it'll be relevant to you for the rest of your life. Where's the marker? Of course not. Right? Like 5 minutes from now, it doesn't matter. See, relevance realization, and there's a technical argument here, it's like biological adaptivity. The great white shark, is its adaptivity in the shark? No, I drop it in the Sahara Desert and it dies. Oh, well, it must be the adaptivity is in the environment, it's in the ocean. No, I drop you in the ocean and you're dead. Adaptivity is a fittedness between the organism and the environment. Relevance is a fittedness between the organism and the environment. Meaning in life is a fittedness between the organism and the environment. That's why meaning in life overlaps with another phenomenon that should be connected to it, the psychology of belonging, work by Kelly Allen. People need to feel like they belong, that they fit in, that they're connected well. By the way, if you don't have belonging, you're seriously in trouble physiologically, socially, psychologically, morally. One way to make you vicious is to denude your sense of belonging for an extended period of time. Then you're willing to do nasty things to people around. Okay. So I've coined a word for this. I know philosophers, I have a PhD in philosophy. Philosophers are the greatest source of neologisms in the world as they continually pronounce against neologisms, which I find really charming. So, meaning, relevance, adaptivity are not subjective, not in the subject, not objective, it's transjective, it's between. It's between. That means that thinking of meaning as something that you have as a possession is a fundamental modal confusion. Meaning can't be found in you, contrary to all, I'm using this technically, bullshit in popular culture. Meaning is fundamentally, and this is William Desmond, great philosophical work. Back to Plato, the taxu. Meaning in life is fundamentally between you. Fundamentally between. That means the world plays the world that other people play an essential role in the meaning in life that you have. It's a modal confusion to think of it as a subjective, internal, merely psychological possession. So notice what I've tried to argue. The current construct is inert. It has no inner structure. It doesn't move. It has no dynamics. It's purely individual. It's just about the individual. It doesn't talk about the historical, cultural dimensions. It's isolated. It's disconnected from trust, loneliness, mental health. That makes no good sense. It's ignorant. It's foolish because it leaves out the irremovable dimension of wisdom. So it's technically foolish. And it's completely internalistic. Meaning is something I just have on my own inside of myself. For all of those, I think it is a completely inept construct. Completely inept. Making a construct pervasive culturally and also academically that is so inept actually undermines and thwarts people's ability to understand and cultivate what I would now regard as a virtue, which is wisdom and meaning in life integrated together. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, John. Wonderful talk. Let me just throw something else to get the conversation going.
Sure.
You were stressing the significance of wisdom.
Yes.
Do you think there's any significance, no pun intended, to the widespread phenomenon of representing wisdom in a female form.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about trust and belonging. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
for most human beings, the first element of trust is, yeah.
Maybe you should continue to talk.
No, no. Not the expert.
No. I mean, I think that's it. So you've got trust and belonging and connection, which have been sort of archetypally and historically associated with the feminine. Where and especially in sort of Anglo-American culture, especially in American culture, where individualistic, masculinity is so prized as like as a norm. I have criticisms of that, but I'm not going to launch into that now. And so, even psychologically, men and women. This is reliable. This goes way back to work done by Deborah Tannen, but it still replicates. Men and women use language differently. This shows up in also how language is distributed in the brain. So in women, it's more equally distributed between both hemispheres. In men, it's more isolated to the left hemisphere. You can hear Ian McGilchrist now rolling in, right? But men have a linear, get to the point attitude towards language, whereas women have a dialogical networking attitude towards language. So a frequent friction between men and women is a woman, and I'm not casting blame on either side. I'm trying to be totally neutral here because no matter what I'm saying, I'm going to piss somebody off. Right? The woman will present what the man takes to be a problem, and the man will try to solve the problem. And the woman will get frustrated and angry because she doesn't want the problem solved. She wants to create a network around the experience. And it took me I'm 63. It took me a long time. It's like, so sometimes I have to be really careful. Sometimes I'll ask my wife, I'll say, do you want me to help you solve this problem? Or do you want me to support you as a friend in this? And so most of the time I want your support. And occasionally you say, no, I want you to help me solve it. But I've learned you have to do that. And so why am I doing all this? The networking, the dialogical, the listening, right? The building of connection. I think what I'm trying to suggest is there's other reasons. I'm not being reductionist. I think there's psychological reasons for the archetype of the feminine being associated with.
Because if you think about the Western tradition alone, the Ultima Mantineer, or Lady Wisdom, Lady Philosophy in Boethius's Consolations, or
even in the Book of Proverbs.
Of course, yeah, exactly. Yes, I mean, so this is Dante's Beatrice, the Fairy Queen, etc., etc. I mean, there's this string of these images of a sort of feminine wisdom figure that sort of verges on the heterodox theologically.
Yes.
Because this is clearly an element of the divine, and yet it can't produce a quaternity or it can't threaten the Trinity, and yet it's there in such prominent places.
And you put your finger on something too, which I hinted at. I didn't foreground it because it is worthy of its own sort of central argument and discussion. One of the things, if you bring in the mystical and the aspirational, and people are, all of David Yates' work on the really real, and people have experiences. See, most of the time when we have altered states of consciousness, we come back and compare it to our everyday life, and we say, oh, that's unreal, like a dream or a drug trip. I know DMT is different. The space cells are real. But what's really interesting is when people have full-blown mystical experiences, what they'll say is, that was really real, and this isn't real in comparison. And what they do reliably is they change their lives, their identity, their careers, their relationships, because they want to participate more in that really real. Putting all that together, the sacred is missing from the current construct. But I think the sacred looms behind this. I think it is the orienting North Star of what people they're trying to get. What signifies what signifies ultimate reality and orients you so you can properly aspire so that your future self is your higher self. These are definitions of the sacred within, religious studies. And I think not only is the meaning in life construct unmoored inappropriately from wisdom, it's unmoored from the sacred in a very important way.
May I throw another interest and obsession of mine before we open the floor to conversation? And that's the theme of play.
Of course.
Because the figure of wisdom in Proverbs is play.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Creation. So what do you make of that?
Well, I make a lot. Okay, so there is play is one of the most fertile ways in which, so I know you don't mean play just as a frivolous pastime. You mean something that can have serious developmental consequences. You and I have talked about this, so I'll just take that as given. So I can use the phrase serious play, right? So one of the forms that one of the things that can frequently result from serious play that is really calling for your full investment and engagement is the flow experience, Csikszentmihalyi. The flow experience is when you're feeling completely engrossed in something and you want to be doing it for its own sake. You feel a tremendous sense of at-one-ment. So I'm a martial artist, and when I get into you want to be in the flow state when you're fighting. It's optimal for performance, right? It's like you're just, and the block, and you've seen the opening and the punch goes in, right? The block punch just goes through. And here's the thing. If you're around that, so you love this language, you don't make it that move. You don't just receive it, you participate in it. And so it's flow, right? And the world is super salient, and there's an ongoing sense of discovery, and time slows down. You get it when you're playing jazz. You get it when you're doing martial arts. You get it when you're rock climbing. There's no other explanation for why people do rock climbing. It's like a Greek mythological torture in Hades. You climb up this, you'll hurt yourself, you'll get really tired, you might fall and kill yourself, and once you get to the top, come back down. We've studied it. People do it because they get into the flow state. Here's now my answer to your question. Being in this, you'd think of this also. It should have lots of study around it, but it makes sense. The more, so if I was out, I want to ask you one question to try and determine what meaningful you find your life. I make sure you understood my description, and then I ask you how many flow experiences you have in your life on an ongoing basis. Do you have a lot? Do you have few? If you have a lot, it predicts that you'll find you'll have more meaning in life. Notice this isn't about crafting great theories. This is about getting into this dynamic, reciprocal, developmental process of play. Serious play. And if your life is impoverished for flow experiences, I strongly, and now I'm just stepping outside of, I strongly recommend you ameliorate them. Flow is anti-depression. Flow is anti-anxiety. Flow is anti-burnout. You're not flowing. You're in trouble. And so I think and I think we often put the two together. I think we often engage in ritual, which I regard as a very important kind of serious play that can often engender the flow experience. And we do that in relationship to what we consider, most real. So I've been playing. You don't do or practice Tai Chi in Chinese. The verb is play, like for playing music. I've been a Tai Chi player since 1991. And when you're doing the form, you are getting into that state in order to try and participate in the Tao. And that pushes all the meaning in life buttons. Very, very powerful. In fact, this is oversimplification, but friends, I think Taoism is the religion of flow. That's what it does. And I'm very strong about this when it gets into an academic setting. If people, and this will sound harsh, if people offer me sort of interpretations of the Tao Te Ching, and they're not doing Tai Chi Chuan or Qi Gong, to me, it's like somebody saying, I really understand the Kama Sutra, and I've never had sex. So you don't get it. You don't get it. You have to do it. You have to play it in order to understand it.
Perhaps drawing a veil over the sex. Questions for John?
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for this absolutely brilliant talk. I guess I want to pick up on one of the key words you've been using, but I think it's really at the heart of your talk, is appropriateness.
Yes.
And then, but my question is actually about, there seems to me there's a prevalent psychology in the West, at least, about the inappropriateness of appropriateness. Is that when you use the term, people get nervous, or people get, I just use real life example, right? When I was writing, my supervisor commenting upon my writing, saying, I write the word paying appropriate attention to the world, and she underlines the appropriateness, saying, is it problematic? I'm saying, interesting. Why, what makes people now they feel like to speak about something appropriate is inappropriate or problematic?
Yeah, we talk about appropriation as something bad to be done, while appropriating a language we did not exist or invent in order to make our declarations, which is a performative contradiction. I'm very critical of this because, and your judgments of appropriateness are a species of the genus of relevance realization. You are appropriately directing your attention and appropriately remembering and appropriately making, the movements. You're nodding your head slightly, right? You're not raising your hand and doing this like you could. So out of all the things you could be paying attention to, all the things you could be remembering, all the things you could be doing, you're ignoring most of them because it fits you to the situation now to be directing your attention, remembering, and enacting the behavior you're enacting. You're zeroing in, you're framing, you're ignoring information in order to be a cognitive agent. To pretend, and it is pretense, and it is bullshit of the highest order, that we could somehow be free from, is like, it's a performative contradiction because she underlined the word in order to focus your attention on it and get you to remember it, and she's making it salient while saying you shouldn't consider things salient in the focus of your attention like this. It's a performative contradiction. It makes no sense. Why is she making that judgment? She thinks it's appropriate to tell you, don't judge things to be appropriate. It doesn't mean you just get to fling your judgments of appropriateness on people. I think that's the kernel of criticism, of critical truth. Well, we should not, look, don't pretend you're biased, free of bias. It's pretense. Try as best you can to do two things. Give arguments that indicate what your framing is, what your bias is, and open yourself up to criticism and commit yourself to self-correction. That's what trying to pretend that we can somehow step outside of our biological and cognitive machinery into some, I don't know what it is, fantastic woke heaven or something, is ridiculous. Because it flies against, look, and it's just going to be smashed. It's being smashed by the LLM. Do you know what those are? Large language models, ChatGPT, artificial general intelligence. All of those concerns are getting smashed because it's turning out that what's at the core of our cognitive agency that we're finding difficult to give the machines that they don't actually have is the capacity for relevance realization. And relevance realization is at the core of being, look, when I'm zeroing in on it, this is an act of caring. This is almost Heideggerian, right? I'm caring for this information rather than that information because I'm a living thing. I'm constantly taking care of my mind and my body, making it from and in my environment moment by moment. The machines don't care about the information they're processing because they don't have to take care of themselves because they're not self-making beings. They don't have relevance realization. This is our defining difference from them. And we are going to ChatGPT 5 is coming in 2 months. Sam Altman is most worried about how, I'll use my language, but it's not inappropriate. He fears that what GPT-5 is going to do is pour gasoline on the fire of the meaning crisis. And we are going to more and more search for those features of us that are untouched by the machines, and relevance realization and our sense of appropriateness is at the core of them. Sorry, it sounded like I paid him to ask me that.
Hello. Earlier in the talk, I think at the beginning, you raised the question of ontology and so the problem of meaning in life that it leaves out. So what can you say about what makes an ontology predictive of meaning, or on the other hand, alienating from meaning?
So I have a remaining part of my talk that I cut off. I want to talk a little bit more about this because you raised the question, so you've given me license to trespass. So I'm going to bring together notions from an anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, and notions from a current sociologist who's having a huge influence on me, Hartmut Rosa. He has a notion of resonance. Moments of resonance are moments like this. You turn a corner and unexpectedly there's a sunset and it just catches your attention and you stop and there's nothing to be done other than witness it, or a snowfall, or you engage in a great conversation and it takes on a life of its own and you can end up in places you didn't foresee. So resonance has a terrific dimension of the uncontrollability of the world, but not terrifying uncontrollability. Right? You're bound to something, but and I'm using this language to give you a connection. You can flow with it. Like when you're martial arts, it's boring to spar with somebody you can predict. You don't grow, you don't learn. It's terrifying to spar with somebody who you can't predict at all, because then you just get cracked. You want somebody that you resonate with. That means you actually have to enter into a relationship of participation. The world and you together have to create some of the most meaningful experiences. Hartmut Rosa has a great phrase for this. You can prepare for resonance, but you can't manufacture it. This is another reason why it's not something you can individually make. Now, what does that have to do with your ontology? And this also overlaps with Clifford Geertz. To Clifford Geertz, have you heard of Clifford Geertz? He's one of the great anthropologists. He's a founder of symbolic hermeneutical approach to ethnography. Don't worry about it. So he made it really interesting and influential, and I find it very plausible. I have criticisms of it, but on the whole, I think it's a very powerful argument that religion isn't meaningful, it is meta-meaningful. And I know you're philosophers, so you'd like to use meta as much as you can, but there's actually, this is well put. So what he means is we have individual systems of meaning, like the legal system or the politeness system or popular culture, but we need something that does something really much more fundamental that makes all of the rest of those systems possible. We need something that shapes us into a particular kind of agent and shapes the world. This is the language that Chris and Philip and I used, into a particular arena for action. So you're all doing it right now. I assume you're taking the role of a student. This is a classroom. And you know how to shape your agency, and you know how to use this space. Does that make sense? And you are doing this all the time. In fact, other organisms do this. This is called niche construction. So we used to think in the early Darwinian days that evolution was just the environment shaping the organism. We now know, and one of my colleagues at the University of Toronto, Dennis Walsh and others, there's a revolution happening in biology right now. It's going through a scientific revolution. Physics is dead. It's been theoretically moribund, not experimental, theoretically for about 60, 70 years. Okay? That's not what's going on in biology. What's going on now is the idea that no, organisms shape the environment as the environment is shaping the organisms. They both participate in a shared process of self-organization. It's called niche construction. So the environment is fitted to the organism is fitted to the environment. So even organisms are doing this to some degree, but there's something special about you. You're cultural. What human beings figured out, notice what I'm doing, is they could put the niche construction machinery on methamphetamines. That's what culture does. Other than your naked bodies and the atmosphere, everything else is culture. And it is shaping you, and it is being shaped to you. This is culture. Notice what I'm wearing. I'm shaping myself to this situation. But this situation has also been shaped to afford me to come in and be a teacher or a scientist or a philosopher. Yes? Geertz argued this is what religion does. It gives us the grammar, in the Chomskyan sense, of the grammar for how agency and arena, how we are to be modeled for the world and how the world is to be modeled for us. It gives us the overarching grammar for that. And then what you get out of it, and this now is getting to the ontology, right, is you can get a worldview that demonstrates resonance. It's worldview attunement in which, right, this is flowing smoothly. The agent, you have a lot of capacity to take up roles of agency in which the world resonates with you. It's not boring or terrifying. You can play in it well. So you belong, you fit. The psychology of worldviews, of course, has a tremendous impact. People's worldviews are not crafted, I would argue, sorry, I shouldn't pronounce, I forgive me. I would argue people's worldviews are not just constructed conceptually. They are constructed also largely by how they can afford worldview attunement. Because if you don't have worldview attunement, the last thing you should be worried about is your metaphysical theories. Because everything else is going dramatically wrong. And so I think leaving out the religious dimension, the metaphysical dimension, what we mean by metaphysics is your fundamental worldview that binds the agent and the world together as a cosmos, a beautiful word. The degree to which that's what's missing from meaning in life is another way in which it's seriously inadequate.
So is that why things like, say, an excessively reductionist or mechanistic worldview can be alienating? Like you can't see yourself.
Yes. So I've been teaching my students since 1994 at the University of Toronto, when I do an introduction to cognitive science, I will say things, I've been saying things like, we're in a really bad situation. We have scientific explanations that generate a worldview, but that worldview doesn't explain how we generate scientific explanations or why we care about them. Or we do stuff like we say, all that's real is the very bottom. All that's real are quarks, whatever the basement level is right now. And everything above it is an epiphenomenon. And then you say, where are you doing the science? You're not doing the science down there. The theories and the mathematical measurements and the computers and the conferences and the publications, are they all illusionary epiphenomena? And yet you're concluding from that dream world what's ultimately real? These are performative contradiction after performative contradiction. My friend, and he was a former colleague of mine, he's now at the University of British Columbia, he was at the University of Toronto, Evan Thompson, and two scientists, Frank and Gleiser, who've written a book very recently, they published it just last year, called The Blind Spot, about we have a worldview that has a blind spot in it, which is it doesn't include in its ontology, it doesn't include the place from which, or the people who are doing the ontology making. Yes. And my argument has been that renders us like an ontological whole in the scientific worldview. We deeply, deeply do not belong. And yet the sense of belonging is our fundamental sense of meaning in life. And so we have this black hole, that's the dome right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. The black hole in which everything gets sucked away. No meaning in life is possible. But here's another thing for which there's the need of argumentation, so I'm asking for your trouble. Without meaning in life, you can't actually get the semantic meaning that goes into theoretical propositions. And so you're into the weird state of making theoretical propositions about nihilism that are undermined because they presuppose meaning in life in order for them to have any semantic meaning. You have this huge blind spot.
Yeah.
May I at that point just ask you about some topic that I think is dear to your heart, shall we say?
Yes.
Because later this week we'll be looking at a philosopher, I should say that some in the group have been attending this course on the history of philosophy from Plato through to Nietzsche, and in the next couple of days we'll be looking at Whitehead.
Yes.
Who, of course, has this metaphysics of event rather than one of substance.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a radical transformation of the tradition, yet at the same time rooted in it. Whitehead himself saying all the Western philosophy just sort of debates Plato.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about the significance of these ontological questions for the work you're doing in the cognitive science?
Very. Some of you may want to take a look at it. Actually, a published video by Douglas and I, James Filler's excellent book on Heidegger and Neoplatonism, because that's relevant to my answer.
Yes, it's just up, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, it's just up. It's doing very well. So thank you. I mean, so first of all, a clear and powerful way in which Whitehead is showing up in all this. Whitehead was motivated and was like continually bound himself to something that he was first to make very clear, that performative contradictions, where the state you're in contradicts the statement you're making about possible states. Okay, that sounds abstract. Here's one. Obvious performative contradictions. I am completely physiologically dead right now. What do I have to be able to, in order to talk? I have to be alive. So I can't ever, no, it's not that, John just proved he's going to live forever. Okay, it's not a propositional contradiction. There's no there's nothing wrong with saying it will at some point be true that John Vervaeke is physiologically dead. Okay? But it's a performative contradiction to make that statement. So do you understand what a performative contradiction is? And what bothered Mike, very similar to the argument I just made, he's the grandfather. He said performative contradictions are as important, if not more important, than propositional contradictions. And so he was frustrated by what he called the bifurcation of nature, in which that from which we did the science was bifurcated, severed from the scientific worldview, very much like I just described. A lot of what you just heard was influenced profoundly by Whitehead wanting to overcome that contradiction and overcome the bifurcation. And he basically centered on, I would take him to center on something, although James has some criticisms of Whitehead, James Filler, but that ontological questions, we have to go through a fundamental rethinking of our ontology in order to overcome those performative contradictions. For example, we can't have blind spots. We can't have a reductive ontology that renders science as a mere epiphenomena, because then we're engaged in a performative contradiction. And so I take that actually at the very heart of the project I have. So I want to, I'm engaged in the project of trying to reformulate the ontology so that it can properly, rigorously hold meaning in life, as much as I'm trying to reformulate the meaning in life construct. To my mind, I couldn't do that, But to my mind, those two projects are inseparably bound together. Everything I'm talking about here, which is why I wanted to find it. What's the actual process? What's the actual development? It's transjective in nature. It's not subjective or objective. All of this is pointing towards, but what kind of ontology and the missing of the sacred, the missing of the ultimate real, what kind of ontology is actually needed to properly hone with scientific rigor, meaning, and I think I take Whitehead as to be, I have criticisms of the specifics of his metaphysics, of his epistemology. I mean, we all do. But I take him as the grandfather of that.
Wow. Further questions for John?
Would you be able to speak to the significance of Neoplatonism in particular in this context?
Yeah. So how much time do you have?
And more.
No, seriously, I've got hours and hours of video up on YouTube where I'm making arguments, sometimes to academic audiences, sometimes at conferences, sometimes to lay audience, about the ongoing convergence between the kind of cognitive science I'm doing with you here and Neoplatonism. I think Neoplatonism, trying to find a place of continuity with what the talk I did. I'm trying to separate that from what's already always here. Clear evidence for three things coming out of cognitive science. Well, why I think those point us back towards Neoplatonism. One is the imaginal relationship to your future self and your higher self. The imaginary, but the imaginal. You're with Douglas Henry. You know the distinction, right? Don't you? Yes or no? Sure. Maybe I shouldn't presume. Okay. Imagination is the way, I'm using it the way Corbin uses it, right? Henri Corbin. The imaginary is inner visualization. You're looking at a picture, and the intent is to remove yourself from reality. Like if I ask you picture a sail or something like that. The imaginal is what's at work in play. So when a kid ties a blanket around his throat, puts his arms out, and runs around like this, and he's playing, pretending to be Superman. He's not looking at an image of Superman. He's trying to look at the world and be in the world the way Superman is, because play, serious play, is how intelligent organisms develop. He's trying to develop the virtuosity and virtues of Superman. That's imaginal. And the imaginal is at the core of your cognition. It's the core of your rational. Look, let's do it. Just do it. I need to get you to just accept this. Okay? In order to be rational, do you give me that you have to be capable of self-reflection? You have to be able to look at your own mind. Yes? You have to be able to monitor, manage, correct. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, necessary, right? Necessary. Okay. You have that capacity. I can ask you what you're thinking about right now. Yes? What did you do? You looked at a space inside your head, right? Is that a literal space? Is there literally a space inside your head? No. Is it merely fictional? No, because it gives you real knowledge of yourself, doesn't it? So it's neither, notice how it falls between our Enlightenment categories, European Enlightenment. It's neither merely fictional, and it's not literal. It's imaginal. It's imaginal. Okay. You have, in order to be rational, I just showed you, you have to have an imaginal relationship to your future self. Look, you can do this experiment. It's been done tons of time. Hirschfield, versions of this. You go into academics, tenured professors, and you give them all the argument and all the evidence that they should start saving for their retirement right now. You let them challenge you as much as they possibly can, and you don't end the session until they all agree that they're convinced they should start saving right now. You come back in 6 months, how many of them are saving? None. Now you replace that intervention with this intervention. I want you every day to picture your future self as a beloved family member that you care about and you've always had responsibility for. Do that every day. You come back in 6 months, what do you find? The people that did the practice are saving. The more vividly they did it, the more they're saving. Rationality is not primarily about logic. It's about overcoming self-deception. And procrastinating and avoiding the future is at the key of irrational self-deception. Control level theory. You can move to higher levels of control. And this is also part of predictive processing. Higher levels of control allow you to see more deeply into the future, and they make you more rational, more flexible, etc. You have to have an imaginal relationship to your higher self. You have to have an imaginal relationship to your future self. Okay? Next point. The idea that how cognition works is I have a computer in here that has representations about the world out there. It's collapsing. It's absolutely collapsing in cognitive science. Why is it collapsing? That computational model doesn't work for all kinds of technical reasons. I gave you one reason why it's collapsing. Where's relevance? Is it in here? Is it out there? Where is it? That's where cognition is. It's here, and it's dynamically between you and the environment. Right? We're going back to a participatory notion of knowing. Organisms know by the world and the organism co-participating in the same niche construction. So you have participatory knowing in the depths. The deepest knowing is by participation. There's imaginal, so it's imaginal, horizontally and vertically. It involves participatory knowing, and it is becoming inherently dynamical and developmental. That there are truths that are disclosed to us only if we are willing to undergo transformation, move up and down the vertical, up towards the future, imaginable. And thirdly, we do not reason well on our own. The European Enlightenment model that intelligence and rationality are done individually, internally, Kant, right, is largely empirically false. You take a standard reasoning test we've been doing since the 60s, the Wason selection test. Very simple test, very simple reasoning. You give it to Ivy League students, because that's what we do all of our psych experiments on, which is a problem, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay? How many of them get it right? Reliably? 10%. 10%. You take the same experiment, you get 4 people, you tell them, talk cooperatively amongst each other, and the success rate goes from 10% to 82%. Because of what I said earlier. I'm crap at noticing my confirmation bias. You're really good at picking it up in me. You're really crap at seeing it in you. I'm excellent at picking it up. So now you've got the dialogical. You've got the imaginal connectedness, the religia to the future self and the higher self. And then you add in this proposal that our knowing of reality is participatory. So the levels of the self, levels of reality are deeply co-participatory. Now you've got everything you need for Neoplatonism. You've got self-world horizontally. This is Eric Pearl's, his commentary on the 3 hypostases. What you have is levels of self-world that have a horizontal participatory relation, and then you have vertical stacking of them. That's Neoplatonism. So I've been making an ongoing argument that the proper homing of 4E cognitive science, that's the kind of cognitive science I'm doing here, that avoids the blind spots, wants to talk about meaning in life, wants to talk about mysticism. The proper homing for that is Neoplatonism. I think a revised Neoplatonism, but a Neoplatonism.
I'd like to stop at that point, but I don't want to occlude any further questions. If anybody's burning to ask John a question, please take the opportunity now or hold your peace. John?
Could I just follow up?
Yes.
So, do you think that, one thing distinctive about Neoplatonism is the apophatic theology pertaining to this.
Oh, that's what Corey Cox is all about. Okay, this is part of my central work. Most of your knowing is not propositional. The knowing that you can put into propositions. Linguistic utterance is literate markings, which is why the LLMs don't do what you do, because that's all they can do. So we have devolved into propositional tyranny, which is an aspect of the meaning crisis. We think that all knowing is knowing that, and then we state a fact, like cats or mouse. That's not most of your cognition. That's not most of your knowing. You have a kind of memory for that. It's called semantic memory. But you have a different kind of knowing. You know how. You know how to catch a ball. And your skills aren't beliefs. They're not true or false. Do you know how to swim? You're not swimming right, but is your swimming true or false? Come on.
True when I'm swimming.
Yeah. But you don't mean propositionally true. You mean it fits in that situation, don't you? It's true to the situation, not like the way a sentence is true. Right? It's a different use. It's trough, to go back to the original etymology. It's bound. Right? And you have a different set of memory for that. Procedural memory. Your semantic memory can be damaged. What's that? The person can't tell you it's a bicycle. Do you know what that is? I don't know what it is. I don't know what it. I've never seen it. Okay, get on it, and then they ride because they still have the skill of bike riding. But that's not the only other kind of knowing you have. You have perspectival knowing. I mentioned it earlier. You know what it's like to be you here right now because you possess consciousness. You know what it's like to foreground and background in this situation. What is salient, what is not salient to you. And you know what state of mind you're in and what the situation is. That's your perspectival knowing. And you have a different kind of memory for that. So how many of you know that cats are mammals? Semantic memory. Put up your hand. How many of you can tell me, without not speculate, but remember when you learn? Okay? How many of you had breakfast this morning? How many of you can tell me what you had for breakfast? What happens when I ask you to do that? You go back into the situation in your mind. It's called episodic memory. You go back and relive the episode. You reenact the state of mind, the perspective on that situation. You have episodic memory. And the sense of realness isn't the truth of a sentence or the power of a skill. It's the sense of presence. The sense of presence. And below that, you have what I was just talking about, participatory knowing, which is largely unconscious. But it's the way in which you are participating in processes in which the environment and you are being co-shaped so that you belong here. You fit in. I think meaning in life is when we bring participatory knowing into our awareness. These are all non-propositional, and they matter much, much more to your cognitive agency than your propositional knowledge. That our culture, since the scientific revolution, the Cartesian revolution, more specifically, has lost the sense of the non-propositional kinds of knowing and devolved towards all that there is to know is to have justified true beliefs. This is why ideology is so pervasive. What Vervaeke says is that is ridiculous. It's not empirically the case. Most of your knowing is in the non-propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory.
And isn't it the case that in a way this is reinforced by the particular usage of the word science?
Yes, very much, yes.
The fact that we don't use it in that broader sense of knowledge.
Yeah, and you see one of the last ditch attempts to keep it from becoming mere propositional assertion is actually in Spinoza. He's trying to get back this broader sense, and that's why he has the three kinds of knowing, and that's why the greatest kind of knowing, scientia intuitiva, is thoroughly non-propositional.
Yeah. Well, John, I think we've all been enthralled by a very powerful, at the same time, enchanting talk. Thank you very much.